Bash is saved. And what a relief that is, because this new variation of the Bash build I have for you is absolutely insane. Part of the problem that I had with the other variants were either not enough damage and really tanky, or tons of damage but not enough defense. Well, I fixed that. Do you want to feel like a super tank in Pits 100 plus? Deal big crits of over 150 million without even having to overpower. And if you're one of those naysayers and you don't want to use Holy Bolts, this is the build for you. I have some gameplay for you of a tier 100 pit run. I didn't use any Holy Bolts. Make sure you pay attention to the gameplay because I'm going to use some of how I run the dungeon in the description later on as I'm going over the build. Check this out. As always, we're going to start with the skills. So let me go over the skills real quick. Well, there you go. Tier 100 all done. No Holy Bolt elixirs. It was actually a pretty quick run too. It's tanky, it does some damage. We had a couple 100 million hits in there that were not overpowers. I'm going to go over the build. I'm going to take some time so that I can show you exactly what I did to make these changes. What I did differently with the skills is I took some of the damage reduction out and I moved some of the points into more damage. What I found when I'm pushing the pit is that when you get into the upper levels, the damage pretty much stays the same. You just need enough damage to kill the bosses in time, which really actually becomes an issue because sometimes I'll have a 7-minute boss fight and I don't even kill it in time. So I'm going to go over the changes and the new interactions that we had for this board. I'm sure some of you have seen, Hoda is now back, but Hoda is not back for what you think. It is not a damage dealer. They nerfed it into the ground, so unfortunately, we're not going to have any damage coming out of that. We are going to go 5 ranks into Bash, and then we're going to go all the way up through Combat Bash. After critically striking 4 times with Bash, using a 2-handed weapon, your next core or weapon mastery skill will overpower. So what that means is Hoda is a core skill. After 4 critical strikes with Bash, this is guaranteed to overpower. The reason that that's important is when we go down into Violent Hammer of the Ancients, after overpowering with Hammer of the Ancients, you deal 30% multiplicative more damage for 5 seconds. So now every time we crit 4 times, we use Hammer of the Ancients, and Hammer of the Ancients gives us an additional 30% damage. Moving down, I drop some max life off of my armor, so we're still going to take 3 points into Imposing Presence. Martial Vigor, we're still going to take our 12% damage reduction from elites. Rallying Cry, we're going to go all the way through Strategic Rallying Cry. We don't need to be generating any additional Fury because we're only using a basic skill. So we're going to take Strategic Rallying Cry. This is going to give us a huge source of Fortify. Iron Skin is going to play a huge part in this build, and not only defensively, but we'll get to that later. Enhanced Iron Skin all the way down through Tactical Iron Skin. This is going to give us a big heal plus barrier, and that's going to be key to doing a lot more damage later on, and also keeping us safe. We went into Warcry, and then we go all the way down through Power Warcry. Now, this is just to make sure that we can clear through trash quickly. This doesn't affect the boss because you need to have at least 6 enemies or more near you when you cast Warcry, and then our damage bonus is increased by 10%. We went 3 points into Swiftness. Anything that can give you movement speed is honestly super important because this helps you dodge boss mechanics. A lot of people skip over movement speed as it's something that doesn't give them any benefit, but being able to move out of the way of a mechanic is life-saving. 3 points in the Booming Voice. Your shout skills effect duration are increased by 24%. This gives us 24% more uptime on Warcry, so more damage, and more uptime Unstoppable from Rallying Cry. Coming down, we have Aggressive Resistance, 12% damage reduction from elites. I have helped a lot of people in this game that are constantly telling me that they're always dying. I don't know what's wrong with their build, but they've all been building into offensive stuff. You need defensive abilities. No matter how good your gear is, and no matter what you're running, you need to have some sort of damage reduction built into your board. Coming down, we're running 3 points into No Mercy for some extra critical strike damage against the stun enemies. We're going to have uptime on stun 100% of the time. Because we're pushing really far into the pit, slaying strikes is going to play a really big role because when monsters are less than 35% life, we're going to gain an additional 23% multiplicative damage against them. So when you get into that final little phase, which is where all of the echoes start to spawn, it gets really, really intense. There's stuff spawning everywhere. We're going to get a little bit of boost of damage so we can kill that boss faster. 3 points in the Pit Fighter for additional damage up close and some extra damage reduction from distant enemies. We're going into Steel Grasp here. Steel Grasp is used to pull a group of monsters to you. Because we have a 100% chance to stun, they get stunned right away. Steel Grasp also makes them vulnerable, which gives us an additional 20% X damage. And then we also gain Berserking for 2 seconds. Now, what this does, it gives us 100% increased damage just from using this one skill. We get stunned, vulnerable damage, and Berserking. We got 1 point here into Thick Skin, 3 points into Counter Offensive for a little bit of extra damage while we're fortified. If you find yourself dying, there is additional damage reduction that you could run into here, but for now, we're not going to be taking it. We don't take any ultimates for this variant. We are going to be going into Heavy-Handed for 15% increased critical strike damage. Wallop, using a bludgeoning weapon, deals additional 15% increased damage to stunned or vulnerable enemies, which we're going to have both. And then this one right here, Concussion. You have to have at least 7 points into this, because then you have up to a 105% chance to stun using a 2-handed bludgeoning weapon, which is what we're going to be using for this build. 105% chance of stun means they are stunned all the time. Finally, we're running Unconstrained. Increases Berserking's maximum duration by 5 seconds, and increases its damage bonus to 100%. What that means, if you read right below the refund cost, Berserking grants 25% increased damage and 15% movement speed. When we have Unconstrained, that damage bonus goes from 25% up to 100%. All right, let's go over the Paragon board. For your starter board here, we're going to be running Exploit Glyph. For your second board, which is going to be your Warbringer node. Now, we're not going to actually be spending Fury, so we don't need to take this legendary node. We're going to be running Pressure. This gives you additional mace damage. While wielding a mace, you deal 20% X increased overpower damage. Some of these overpower hits hit really, really hard. Our next board, we're going to go into your Blood Rage board. Blood Rage legendary node was changed from last season to this season. Last season, it could scale up infinitely where your current bonus is. This season, it can only go up to 30%. So we're going to walk a fine line between putting points into damage while berserking and then taking them out of damage while berserking so that we make sure that we're just hitting that note, because this way we can use our Paragon points in other areas. In the Blood Rage board, we are going to be running Iron. We took just the minimum here to get our damage while berserking up just enough to make sure that we hit that 30%. This also grants us an additional 10% damage reduction while we're berserking. Moving up, we're going to be going into the Bone Breaker board. This is split between the two. This way we cut down on the path between the glyph and the legendary node. In this board, we're going to be running Martial. Every time that you cast a shout, both your Steel Grasp and your Iron Skin are going to get reduced by 2 seconds. It's going to be very, very crucial to keep Iron Skin up at all times for this variant. The next board that we're going to go into is we're going to build into Carnage board. While berserking, critical strikes increase your attack speed by 2%, up to 16% for 6 seconds. In this board, we're going to go with Might. This gives us 8% multiplicative damage while using a two-handed weapon, which we're going to be doing. And it also grants us 125% bonus to all of the magic nodes within range. So it gives us a little bit of extra damage while berserking and some extra damage reduction from close. After this, you're just going to path over here so that we can get our Bone Breaker node. And then we can pick up our Bulwark. Then our final board, we go all the way back down here. And we're going to be going into the Decimator board. Each time they make an enemy vulnerable, their damage is increased by 10% X for 5 seconds. Overpowering a vulnerable enemy grants an additional 10% bonus for 5 seconds. So 20% multiplicative damage as long as we are overpowering. And if you remember, every 4 critical strike chances with Bash, we guarantee an overpower with Hoda. So now we're going to be guaranteeing ourselves to get that additional 20% multiplicative damage, as well as going into our Bone Breaker node. We also have guaranteed overpower here. So this is going to be a huge source of damage as we're constantly going to be guaranteeing our overpowers for this. In the board here, we're running Undaunted. This gives us a little bit more damage while fortified and some damage reduction while fortified as well. Okay, I'm going to go over all the aspects. You can follow along in the planner below. I'm going to make sure that whatever I'm talking about here matches the planner. Stat-wise, I still have some pieces of gear that I don't even have that's optimal for this build that I'm still looking for. So you're going to see a little variant between what I have for affixes on my gear versus what's in the planner. But the planner is going to be your optimal gear that is going to get this build up and running the absolute best. On the helmet, we're going to be running Iron Warrior. Iron Skin grants Unstoppable and 34% up to 35% damage reduction. That is a huge, huge source of damage reduction just from one spot. And having the Unstoppable now gives us 2 sources of Unstoppable. Iron Skin, as well as Rallying Cry. When you're pushing the pit and there's all of that stuff on the ground and you need to be able to run through it or get out of a stun or a freeze or whatever it is, this is going to be an extra way to make sure that you can get out of that and keep yourself safe. For the affixes, we want to run Strength, Max Life, and Cooldown Reduction. The armor I would actually prefer to have on my boots, but I just haven't found a helmet that's good enough yet or has any CDR. We want to run 1 Resistance, plus we want to run 3 points of Concussion. Remember, we have to get that Concussion to 7, so that this way we have 100% uptime on our stuns. For the chest piece, we're running Exploiters. You have 20% increased crowd control duration, which is our stuns. While enemies are unstoppable, you deal 40% multiplicative increased damage to them. Now, bosses, when you're fighting them, are always going to be unstoppable. So we're actually giving ourselves an additional 40x damage to bosses the entire time we're fighting them. This really comes into play when we're pushing high levels into the pit because the bosses have so much life, we got to squeeze every little bit of damage out that we can. For the affixes here, Strength, Max Life, ranks to Iron Skin cooldown, and crowd control duration. This is perfect. This is every affix that I was looking for right here. Just like every other variant, for this build, we have to be running Pain Gorgers. I would love a lot more critical strike chance on this and probably some greater affixes, but for now, we're continuing to hunt. This is part of the grind. and I love it. On the pants, we're going to be running Might, your basic skills, which is Bash, which is our main source of damage. We're always going to be using it. It's going to grant us 20% damage reduction for 7 seconds. So all you got to do is just make sure that as you're running from monster to monster, just tap somebody with Bash to keep up that 20% damage reduction, because in case you get hit by something that you weren't expecting, you're going to have a lot more damage reduction up to constantly keep yourself safe. For affixes, we're going to be running Strength, Max Life, and Resistance to All. And on your pants, instead of running Challenging Shout cooldown reduction, this was from the other variant that I had, you want to look for Barrier Generation. This is going to give Iron Skin even more of a barrier, and this is exactly what we want because this is going to increase our damage and increase our survivability. 3 points into Concussion, so now we have 6 points from our Tempering. We have 3 here, and we have 3 here. That gives us our 7, which gives us a 100% guaranteed chance to stun enemies. For our boots, we're going to be running Hectic. After casting basic skills, which is Bash, which is what we always use, 5 times, one of your active cooldown is reduced by 2 seconds. This is really, really big because we're going to be using this as we're running past monsters to constantly be resetting the cooldown of all of our skills. For the affixes here, we're going to be running Strength, Max Life, and instead of Ranks to Warcry here, we're going to want to put Armor on this. So if you look here at this little possible affixes, we can roll Armor. We need to be at 9,230. That is cap. I am just 107 over, so this is actually perfect. So you don't want to try and be super far over. You want to try and not be under. So this gives us a great target to shoot for when we're trying to put our armor affixes on. Crowd control duration here and movement speed. Like I said, movement speed is life. I'm going to say it in every video that I do. I'm going to say it to anybody that asks, get movement speed because it's going to keep you alive and you can't do damage if you're dead. On our weapon, we're running Moonrise. Damaging an enemy with a basic skill, which is what we use with Bash, grants 4% increased attack speed for 10 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. Upon reaching maximum stacks, which is 5 hits, you enter a Vampiric Blood Rage, gaining 160% increased damage to your basic skill and 15% movement speed. So your Bash is going to gain that additional damage after you've hit 4 times, and this lasts for 10 seconds. On the weapon, this is pretty standard across the board. We're going to be running Strength, Max Life, Critical Strike damage. We're going to do damage while berserking on our first 2 weapons, and then damage close on our second 2 weapons. And we're going to run Bash, Cleave damage. If you're going to be masterworking, this is really where you want to try and get your points to go into Bash Cleave. I've only been lucky on one of my weapons, so I have a lot more work to do. Our next weapon, we're going to be running Edge Master. Same thing, mine isn't optimal, but I had a greater affix here for vulnerable damage, so I kept it. Strength, Max Life, Critical Strike damage would be optimal, but I'm running vulnerable here. And then damage while berserking for the second weapon. And then again, we're going to be running Bash Cleave damage. Edge Masters skills deal up to 20% X increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast, receiving the maximum benefit while you have full primary resource. Because we're primarily using Bash and we're going to Hoda occasionally, most of the time our resource, which is our Fury, is going to be maxed out. So we're going to be constantly gaining this 20% X damage. Next weapon, we're going to be running Intercom. If you go back and watch the gameplay, there's going to be a lot of times where I'll run past a group of monsters, I stop for a second, and then I'll use Steel Grasp, pull everything in, because Intercom deals 10% X increased damage. Triple this bonus after standing still for 3 seconds. So the gameplay strategy is to run past, you stop moving, everything comes towards you, you Steel Grasp, everything pulls in, they get stunned, then you pop all your stuff and you start attacking, and then you have that extra damage and everything dies. It's pretty crazy to see. Go back and watch it. Affixes here, we're running again Strength, Max Life, Critical Strike damage. It's exactly what you want to be running for weapons. Then we start moving into damage close. Damage close is going to be your biggest damage modifier out of anything that you could put on here because it gives you the most additive damage. And then we're going to be running Bash Cleave. Next weapon, we're going to be running Rapid. Rapid gives your basic skill 60% increased attack speed. We want to be attacking as much as possible because you saw all of the different interactions between what Bash does, how it attacks, how many other skills rely on Bash hitting over and over and over again. Strength, Max Life, Critical Strike damage for your weapon, damage close, and then Bash Cleaves. On your ring, this is really, really important, and I got incredibly lucky here. Critical Strike chance is going to be your end-all be-all on your rings. Find this first because this is going to be something you can build around because you want Bash to be critting as much as humanly possible because it interacts with Hoda, and that gives you additional damage, so you want to get that maxed. I didn't really want damage on the ring. I really wanted damage close. This was the only ring that I found that had a greater affix for Critical Strike chance, and I was able to roll attack speed on it. So we went with it. For your tempering, we're running Steel Grasp cooldown. We want to try and get as much of this as we can so that we can use Steel Grasp because you saw the interaction when we talked about the skills. Vulnerable damage, stun, and berserking. The other temper for damage is actually supposed to be damage to close. I still have 5 tempers left on this ring, so as soon as I'm done with this, I'm going to be heading back over to the blacksmith. I'm going to see if I can get a lucky roll there. Your next ring, and this is the big change that I made here. I haven't seen this used anywhere else, and I wanted to try and experiment with it because I'm trying to squeeze out as much damage as possible. I'm running Conceited. You deal 25% increased damage while you have a barrier active. If you remember, we took the points into Iron Skin to give us a barrier. Iron Skin grants a barrier that absorbs 142% of your maximum life. Also going to be trying to roll barrier generation on our pants for our tempering. This will only add to the size of the barrier that's generated from Iron Skin. The bigger the barrier, the longer it's up, the more we have that additional 25% X damage there. I have noticed a huge change just by running these variants here. Upwards of 100 to 110, 115 million just regular bash crits. There's no overpowers and no holy bolts. The amulet, we're running adaptability. This is key to this build. The only part of this aspect that we're really going to focus on is when cast at or above 50% maximum resources, which we always will be, because we're only going to be using bash. Oda is not going to take half of our resources, so we're always going to be above 50%. Your basic skills deal 120% increased damage. So now let's look at this. We have 120% increased damage to basic skills here. We have 160% damage to basic skills here. We have 200% damage to basic skills here. Plus, we're going to be running bash damage, bash damage, bash damage, bash damage. This is what pulls this whole entire build together and makes this an incredibly fun, incredibly strong, and very tanky build to play. For the affixes on the amulet, this is actually exactly what I wanted. Unfortunately, I didn't get any of the rolls on my greater affix for critical strike chance, so I may have to reset this and try and do it again later on down the road when I get a bunch of materials. But we got cooldown reduction, critical strike chance, attack speed. We're going to be running one of our resistances and movement speed. Those are the aspects. Let me talk a little bit about the gameplay loop, and then I'll let you guys hop right into the build, try it out, and let me know what you think about it. So for your gameplay loop, and a couple of things that you need to know about this. I cannot actually test the whole entire thing in the training grounds. You actually have to test it out in the wild. The reason for that, Iron Skin can only be used when you've taken damage. So you have to make sure that this is something that is on your trigger finger, that you are ready to push as soon as you start taking damage. The only thing that I'm going to talk about today is the interaction between Pain Gorgers and your damage. The way the Pain Gorgers works is when you're damaging an enemy with a non-basic skill, it marks that enemy for 3 seconds. When your basic skill first hits that marked enemy, the skill damage is echoed to all marked enemies, dealing 200% increased damage. So when you have this little group of monsters here, when you use your Steel Grasp, you're going to try and hit every single one of them. It's going to put a circle above it, which I'll show you. And when you hit this first training dummy, that damage that you hit here is spread around all of them. This means that it's taking all of the damage that you're doing to the single target, spreading it to all of the enemies. They're all taking the same amount of damage. It's basically creating its own little form of AoE. So let me show you how it works. Now, when we use Steel Grasp, all of these little circles above their heads, that is your marked targets. When we only hit one target, it only does damage to just the single target. Now, when we mark them, it's going to do damage to all of the targets. So your rotation is here. You're going to start with Steel Grasp, and then you're going to pop Warcry. After you pop Warcry, you're going to start using Bash. And when you start using Bash, you're going to watch until your little symbol falls off above their head, and then you're going to use Steel Grasp again. So it looks like this. Steel Grasp, Warcry, Bash. Symbol disappears, chains, and you continue to Bash. That's going to be your rotation at its base. Now we're going to add in a little bit extra. As soon as you use your Steel Grasp, when you're out in the wild, and I can't do this in here, use Steel Grasp, use your Warcry, pop your Iron Skin, because when things get pulled to you, no matter what, you always take a tiny little bit of damage. You're going to use that Iron Skin to proc that extra 25% damage. This symbol right here, this is the symbol that guarantees Hoda to overpower. So now I know Hoda is going to overpower. So I'm going to use Steel Grasp, Hammer of the Ancients, Warcry, and then I'm going to start bashing. And you're going to see a very big increase in damage. Steel Grasp, Hammer of the Ancients, Warcry, and then we attack. As soon as the damage falls off, we put it back up. And then we just keep the rotation going. Unfortunately, we can't see our buffs down here as they go, but now we have 4 again. So if you're paying attention and you saw the overpower damage in there, it looked like 350 million. That's not including your 25% X damage from your Iron Skin and Conceited. This build hits really, really hard, and if you can get the rotation down, it's a lot of buttons to push, but you're going to love it. It's tanky because you get all of that damage reduction from Iron Skin. Iron Skin cools down really, really quickly because of Hectic. Bash, combined with Pain Fortress, is just slaying everything all with AoE. Whether you want to use Holy Bolts or you don't want to use Holy Bolts, this is going to be the build for you. Get out there, try this build out. Let me know what you think. Give me some comments. I'd love to brainstorm with you. I'm going to be live on YouTube and Twitch just about every single night. Let me know what you think of the build. Stop in, talk to me about it. Let's get the best version of Bash out there that we possibly can.